Hello, welcome to this week's Edgar Markov deck. This is a tribal vampire deck, and as usual we start out with Soul Ring. We have a Blood Tribute from Zendikar, and of course we all know what this is for. Destroying your opponent, lose half their life. If it was kicked, which was with a vampire, you gain more. In some cases you can gain quite a bit of life. Next we have Blade of the Blood Chief, another Zendikar card. It gives counters for every creature killed, gains you power. You're going to have a lot of vampires, so every vampire that dies is going to buff it up. Shiving Gorge. Most decks leave mana at the end of turn to do something. This will help you do something as well, including just ping the opponent for an extra 1 for triggering any effect that needs it, such as Bloodthirst. Here we have Welcoming Vampire. Creature Flying Vampire. 2/3. Whenever one or more other creatures with power 2 or less enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So Edgar Markov, Marklar, as we like to call him, he's going to make you a lot of 1/1s. Every time you cast a vampire, you get a 1/1, so she'll give you vampires. That'll guarantee a trigger. Null Priest of Oblivion, return to Zendikar or something. Kicker, Menace, Lifelink, Vampire Cleric creature. 2 mana, 2/1, Kicker 4. When Null Priest of Oblivion enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Essentially, it's just a revival spell for 6. But for 2, you also get a 2/1 with Menace Lifelink, giving Welcoming Vampire something to draw from. Brackish Hair. So, whenever a vampire you control deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. This guarantees your 1/1s will keep attacking, gaining power, dealing damage. It is a creature as well, so it's a red creature, red vampire, 2/2. It will want to be on the field, but you don't exactly want to attack with him as well, unless you can divvy it up. Now this is a heavy attacker. Falkenrath Marauders for 5. It's a 2/2, Flying Haste. Whenever Falkenrath Marauders deal combat damage to a player, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. This may have fallen off with the recent release, but it is a red vampire, making it playable in this deck. For 5, it's quite an ask, but you will be getting a 4/4 when it hits. You do want to have freedom to attack. The Brackish Hair, of course, adding to that +1/+1 counters. Legion Lieutenant, 1 white and 1 black for a 2/2. Other vampires you control get +1/+1. Every deck needs an anthem. White has a lot of anthems. Black has a lot of anthems. To have it on a Vampire Knight creature, very useful. Ixalan was a very good set for the most powerful vampires so far, and it continues to do so. Vampire Nighthawk. There is a rare version that has been released, but this is the original that spawned it. With 3 mana, you get a Flying Death Touch Lifelink, 2/3. That is such an upside when it first came out. Zendikar was a creature-heavy set, so Flying Death Touch Lifelink meant this creature killed a lot of Eldrazi when it came out, when the Rise of the Eldrazi was spawned. Very invaluable. And afterwards, it still had play because having a creature that can ping over 2 damage and gain you life while being free to attack was a huge boon. And in the late game, a kill card. Here we have a Evolving Wilds. With 3 colors, you kind of need more than 1 fetch land. Akum Refuge to gain 1 life. Another command tower. Every deck needs command tower. Opal Palace. I'm surprised not more people know about this card. Very useful. It gives a +1/+1 counter if you played your commander with it. Here we have a Ravnica bounce land. It's called that because it gives +2 and it bounces a land back to your hand. These are an improvement over the original version, which was you return an untapped land to your hand. Now that has just an upside, and cards will only get better from here. Nomad Outpost. Nomad Outpost enters the battlefield tapped. It's part of a cycle of tricolors that started in Alara. Very useful that in Tarkir they re-released them under the other 5 colors that were missing. Here's a Rakdos bounce land, a Boros Guildgate. Any gates, any lands that enter tapped can always be replaced with better versions, such as like a Bloodfell Caves is technically better for a tapped land because it does give you 1 extra mana. But whenever you can, you want untapped land. Clifftop Retreat enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a mountain or a plains. Therefore, as cards come out, there will be more cards that say plains, island, swamp. If it has more than 1 symbol, more than 1 land type, it will get another bonus. Dark Imposter. Creature, Vampire Assassin. 6 mana, 2 black. So 4 regular mana, 2 of it has to be black mana. Exile target creature and put a +1/+1 counter on Dark Imposter. The exiling can be countered if they stifle the effect, but essentially, this creature is graveyard hate and somewhat of a dimmer doppelganger. For 3, it's a 2/2 and only gets stronger. So for 6, which is a big ask, it does become a 3/3. Ideally, you're getting activated abilities, such as, what's a good example? Activated being tapping for mana? Anything like that would improve him. So whether it's mana production, tap to kill target creature, things like that. Keru Mind Eater, 3/1/3 menace. When Keru Mind Eater deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles a card from his or her hand face down. You may look and play that exiled card with Keru Mind Eater. So it has menace, meaning it'll get through most of the time. It being only 1 damage means the opponent doesn't see it as a threat unless they really want to save the cards in their hand. The player who was dealt damage chooses the card that gets exiled. But if it's a land, you may play it for your land for the turn. If it is any other type of card, it still restricts you because you cannot play any color other than what your commander can produce. But on the other hand, because your commander has 3 colors, that only limits you from 2 of them. If the opponent is playing anything with blue and green, you won't be able to cast it, but all other cards are pretty viable. Here we have Pawn of Ulamog. This is one of the vampires that surrendered to the Eldrazi. Whenever Pawn of Ulamog or another non-token creature you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you may put a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token onto the battlefield. It has sacrifice this creature, add 1 to your mana pool. This is incredibly useful. So many vampires are summoned. Obviously, your token vampires created by Eminence are not going to be triggering this, but because of the recursion of vampires and black in general, white in general, it will keep triggering as long as he's on the field, getting free mana for your creatures. Here's an example of a creature you want to keep returning. Gatekeeper of Malakir. Creature, vampire warrior, 2/2 for 2. Kicker, 1 black. When Gatekeeper of Malakir enters the battlefield, If it was kicked, target player sacrifices a creature. You usually want to play him for all 3 black. In a tight spot, you will be playing him for 2 for 2, which is at rate. But the sacrificing creatures ability really brings his effect into play, like a Grixis. Captivating Vampire. Other vampires, creatures you control, get +1/+1. Tap 5 untapped vampires you control. Gain control of target creature. It becomes a vampire in addition to its other types. The more vampires you play, the better, clearly. Giving them an anthem, +1/+1, will keep them alive. And with this second effect, you will steal their very, very best cards and make it even stronger. Vampire Hexmage. Pretty much one of the best cards printed. It really gives to show Zendikar was ahead of the time with first strike, sacrifice this creature, remove all counters from target permanent. Permanents being cards that are on the field. 2/1 for 2. That's good rate. It has first strike, so it's most likely living against other 2/2s. Even better. Very strong. I would put Dark Depths in this deck if I could. Markov Blade Master. For 3, it's a 1/1, but it does have double strike. Creature Vampire Warrior. Whenever Markov Blade Master deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. This is a bit lackluster, but it is a finishing blow. With all the Anthem cards buffing it, with the double strike, it will eventually outgrow the 1/1 stat and deal, with the first strike, 1 damage, with the second strike, 2 damage, and then the next turn, 3 damage with the first strike, 4 damage with the second strike. It will grow if it's allowed to live, but it's hard to get that first hit off, so you need to, once again, control the board. Stromkirk Captain for 3, first strike. Other vampire creatures you control get +1/+1 and have first strike. Once again, letting you have a attacking army, putting the pressure on the opponent. It's a 2/2 for 3, but the effect of first strike on vampires has clearly shown that's what they're building towards. Giving first strike to creatures with Death Touch and Lifelink makes it even more valuable. Gifted Aetherborn for 2 has Death Touch Lifelink. 2/3 is a creature Aetherborn vampire. You're not going to see many Aetherborn, so as the game progresses in the future, and including other cards like Changelings, Aetherborn effects will become more consistent, but until then, it's a very obscure creature type, but I'm glad it's part of the vampires. Malakir Bloodwitch is for 5, a 4/4, creature Vampire Shaman, flying, protection from white. When Malakir Bloodwitch enters the battlefield, each opponent loses life equal to the number of vampires you control. You gain life equal to the life lost this way. It's a turnaround card back when it was released, being able to swing the tide, but right now, in this game, it's a closing finisher if you can, but if you can't, for 5, it's a flying protection from white. The protection from white is incredibly useful, especially with if the play group allows it, a 1/1 Sarah Ascendant, which it was released around the same set as, so it springs to mind. Now, protection from white is very niche. We have Skeletal Vampire for 6. 3/3 flying creature vampire skeleton. When Skeletal Vampire enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 black bat creature tokens with flying. For 5, sacrifice a bat. Create 2 1/1 black creature tokens with flying. Sacrifice a bat. Regenerate vampire skeleton. This is incredible recursion for himself, being able to produce his own vampires as well for 5. Ideally, you want to reduce that cost, but there are very many abilities that will want bats. So being able to create creatures while sacrificing them is optimal. Cards that are like Martyr's Bond or need fodder to sacrifice are going to use up a lot of bats, but a card with 5 cost becomes more hard to use. It's useful that you get 3 creatures for 6, and sacrificing a bat to regenerate him is the optimal style, but it most likely won't trigger. If you can combo it, it'll be even better, because Bloodthirst 3 on Bloodlord of Vazagoth will guarantee you keep getting damage. Bloodlord of Vazagoth is 5, 3/3, creature vampire warrior, Bloodthirst 3, flying. Whenever you cast a vampire creature spell, it gains Bloodthirst 3. Once again, bringing the idea of attacking, constant pressure, using your overpowered effects and very cheap creatures to deal damage, get an effect, and then get even better creatures out of it is the idea. Dealing 1 damage with 1 land isn't optimal, but if you have a creature attacking every turn, this effect triggers more often, as well as using your vampires, your bats, to get another buff. Here's one of my favorite cards, Drana Calastria Bloodchief. For 5, she's a 4/4 flying. Legendary creature, Vampire Shaman. X and 2 black mana, target creature gets -0/-X until the end of turn. And Drana Calastria Bloodchief gets +X/+0 until end of turn. This is a kill card. This will kill most creatures and then attack over them. You want to be able to kill most creatures, but for 5, she's assuming that you're going to be able to kill a card for a creature with 3 power next turn if you use all the mana towards her effect. Very useful, because -X goes around indestructible, which the game has led into with a lot of green creatures. The more mana you spend on her, the more powerful she gets as well. Necropolis Regent for 6 is a 6/5 flying. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, put that many +1/+1 counters on it. Leading into the +1/+1 counter theme, but more so the damage. Constantly attacking to gain a value means you will always have the bigger board state with this creature. That's the reason why it's a mythic rare, but in the sense, there are cards that will always outpace it, such as an Anger or Wonder or those kinds of cards. But her damaging effect for 6 is what is the most useful. Anawan the Rune Sage for 5. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player sacrifices a non-vampire creature. Most likely you will sacrifice a bat, but if you do, you can always create more bats if you have the mana available, but your opponent will be sacrificing more creatures than you are. Slaughter Specialist. This is surprisingly a vampire. For 2, it's a 3/3 creature vampire warrior. When Slaughter Specialist enters the battlefield, each opponent creates a 1/1 white human creature token. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Slaughter Specialist. More +1/+1 counters, and with Anawan, your opponent's most likely going to sacrifice that creature, or they're going to face a lot more vampires. Soul Collector. For 5, it's a 3/4 creature vampire with flying. Whenever a creature dealt damage by Soul Collector this turn is put into a graveyard, return that card to play under your control. It also has Morph 3, so for 3 mana, you play it for face down as a 2/2. At any point at instant speed, you can flip it to become this creature. So this card is assuming the opponent's not aware of what's happening. They attack. They assume it's a 2/2, but they know it could be anything. You block, pay 3 mana, and reveal Soul Collector. It's a 3/4, so if you blocked wisely, you will most likely deal 3 damage, kill their card. This card will survive because it has 1 more toughness, and then deal the effect. Instead of it being put into the graveyard, you will now have that creature. Certainly it is fodder for Anawan as a sacrifice, but you're not always going to have Anawan, but you are going to be able to trick your opponent into attacking or blocking a creature that will eventually turn to your side. For 3 mana is not a high cost to put a card onto the field. It will also let you draw a card with Welcoming Vampire. But the effect of stealing a creature for surprise is very effective. Here we have my heavily damaged foil Butcher of Malakar for 5. 4/5/4 flying. When Butcher of Malakar or another creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature. Now, even if you lose your Soul Collector, Butcher of Malakar will make the opponent suffer. Anawan the Rune Sage, if you ever forget a card needs to be sacrificed and you sacrifice something that is, let's say, a bat, now Butcher of Malakar doubles it to more punish. That's what it is. It's more punish. Champion of Dusk for 5. Creature, Vampire Knight. When Champion of Dusk enters the battlefield, you draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the number of vampires you control. 4/4 for 5, but it draws you a lot of cards. You lose life, but it's worth it. Drawing cards and getting a powerful board state will lead you ahead. Stenezia Bloodhole adds colorless, but for 5 and tapping it, so technically 6, it deals 2 damage to target player. So 2 more mana, you deal 2 damage instead of 1, comparing it to Shivan Gorge. Patron of the Vein for 6, Vampire Shaman creature, 4/4 with flying. When Patron of the Vein enters the battlefield, destroy target creature an opponent controls. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, exile it and put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. Wow, this is just straight up good. Like, you just get value for killing cards. Amazing. You need it. If you're running vampires and you have black, why not? Mathis, Fiend Seeker. I only put him in because Edgar Markov is the same colors. I would switch this out for any of the new Caves of Ixalan vampires. Menace, at the beginning of your end step, put a bounty counter on target creature an opponent controls. For as long as that creature has a bounty on it, it has, when this creature dies, each opponent draws a card and gains 2 life. So you will gain 2 life and draw a card whenever that creature dies. It's really lackluster. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, and it's making you think about the opponent's cards, and the upkeep is not worth it. For 3 different colors, you get a 3/3 with Menace, but you have to wait until your end step, so after you play him, put a bounty counter on 1 card. If it dies right away, you only get to draw 1 card and gain 2 life for 3 mana. It's alright. I mean, you can make a case that other cards in the deck are already worse, but for 3 colored mana, there's cheaper vampires. Vona, Butcher of Magan, for 3 colorless and 1 black, 1 white. He's a legendary creature, Vampire Knight, 4/4, Vigilance lifelink. Tap, pay 7 life, destroy target non-land permanent. Activate this ability only during your turn. Ideally, you'd like to keep doing this effect, but paying 7 life makes it a costly decision. If you don't already have the life gain in play, you will quickly lose your life. So a card like Blood Tribute will help you sustain yourself. It itself, having Vigilance lifelink and for 5, helps attack, gain you life, and before the end of turn, kill a card. Here we have Vein Drinker, flying for 6, 4/4. Vein Drinker deals damage equal to its power to target creature. That creature deals damage equal to its power to Vein Drinker. Whenever a creature dealt damage by Vein Drinker, this turn dies. Put a +1/+1 counter on Vein Drinker. So you pay 1 red and tap it, and it fights another creature. If it kills it, it gets a +1/+1 counter. It doesn't have haste. It is for 6 for a 4/4. It will most likely sit there for a turn as a defender, before being able to start eating other monsters, but it has potential. It's a unique effect for vampires, but Vona technically outshines it. That's why Vona is mythic. Vein Drinker is rare. Blood Baron of Viscopa. Lifelink, protection from white and from black. As long as you have 30 or more life, an opponent has 10 or less life, Blood Baron of Viscopa gets +6/+6 and has flying. I've never heard of anyone banning this card, but it seems like the type of card you would want to ban in EDH right away. But as far as I know, it's legal, and it was printed in a set with EDH, so it being for 5 mana, 10/10, with protection from white and from black and flying, yeah, it's Sarah Ascendant, but on turn 5. Zagra, Thief of Heartbeats. For 6, Vampire Rogue. This spell costs 1 less for each creature in your party. So it itself being a rogue, that's one of the party members. Probably Wizard, Warrior. I feel like there's one more. Probably Cleric. Flying, Death Touch, Haste. Other creatures you control have Death Touch. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a Planeswalker, destroy that Planeswalker. This is Planeswalker Death Touch. That makes him worth it in the longest run, because Planeswalkers will only get stronger. Lycia, Sanguine Tribune. For a whopping 8 mana, it's a 4/4. Costs 1 less for each 1 life you gained this turn. So at max, it'll be a 3. So you reduce it by 5 by gaining 5 life. It does have First Strike and Lifelink itself, and it does say pay 5 life, put 3 +1/+1 counters on Lycia. Activate only on your turn and once each turn. It becomes a 7/7 for 5 life. Not bad. Not bad at all. But also, you just gave up 5 life that you just gained. It's more of a win more card, but it does turn the tides with its incredible effect. Stromkirk. Yeah, Stromkirk. Stromkirk Occultist. For 3, it's a 3/2. Creature Vampire Horror. Trample. Whenever Stromkirk Occultist deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of your library. Until the end of turn, you may play it. It has Madness, so if you discard this card, instead of discarding it to the graveyard, you may pay 2 mana and put it to the field. It doesn't have Haste, but it does have Trample, meaning when it deals combat damage, you're probably going to exile the top card of your deck, get a card you can't play, but if it's a land, that's a free drop. If you have spare mana on your open turn, it is worth it. So it may take over your play for the turn. Urkana Cutthroat for 3. Creature Vampire Warrior. 3/2, level up 3. First 2 level ups, so 6 mana, or you give it 1 counter for 3. It becomes a 4/3 with Death Touch. Give it a second counter, it's still a 4/3 with Death Touch, so you've spent 3, 6, 9 mana on this card. Once you've spent 12 mana, a 1 more level up counter, it is a First Strike Death Touch 5/4. It takes a while to get to 12 mana, but if you have the spare mana, it'll jump it up. There are cards in black, obviously, that'll speed it up. The best part is the First Strike Death Touch innately. For 6 mana, you get a 4/3 Death Touch. Not the worst deal. It grows in value, that's what I'll say. When the set came out, there was a lot of cards that gave level up counters for free, or entered and gave other cards level up counters. Now it's just sitting there waiting to kill a card, so at rate you can exchange it for a better card, but in the late game when you're top decking, this is a great card to top deck. Here we have a Rocky Tar Pit. Rocky Tar Pit enters the battlefield tapped. Next turn, untap. Tap it, sacrifice Rocky Tar Pit. Search your library for a swamp card or mountain card and put it onto the battlefield. Then shuffle your library. Free mana, but you wait a turn. Again, similar to Terramorphic Expanse or Evolving Wilds, more card search. Urborg Volcano enters the battlefield tapped, adds black or red. Vivid Crag enters the battlefield tapped, more useful than the other two types of tapped lands, but still, it only gives charge counters. Vivid Crag enters the battlefield with 2 charge counters on it. Remove one of the charge counters and tap it. You get any color of mana, being black or white, depending on what you need. Here we have Myriad of Landscapes, a very strong card, enters the battlefield tapped. If you don't need to use it right away, you can just use it for 1 mana. But for 2 and tapping it, so 3 mana, essentially a Cultivate, search your library for up to 2 target basic land cards that share a land type, then put them onto the battlefield tapped. Shuffle your library. You will always want to have more than 2 cards of that land type in your deck to guarantee you can fetch them. That's just basic math. If you have one of them in your hand, you'll want to go for the other 2. Temple of the False God. For 2, no, it adds 2 mana when you tap it. You need 5 lands in order to activate this effect. Until you have your 5th land, this is a dead card. So, never keep it in your opening hand is my best advice for this. Forsaken Sanctuary. Forsaken Sanctuary enters the battlefield tapped, and it adds black or white. Scored Barrens enters the battlefield tapped, but you gain 1 life. Cinder Barrens enters the battlefield tapped, adds black or red. Orzhov Guildgate enters tapped, adds either white or black. Skull Clamp, one of the most effective cards in the game. Equipped creature gets +1/-1. When a equipped creature dies, draw 2 cards, equip for 1. With Edgar Markov giving you 1/1 vampires, you get a lot of draw power from this effect. Speaking of draw power, we have Phyrexian Arena, allowing you to draw a new card every turn. At the beginning of every upkeep, you lose a life and draw a card. Very useful. This is a 2-for-1. On turn 4, your opponent might have 1 creature, and if you play this, it guarantees on the next turn, they're not likely to play another creature. This card will fizzle, but at least you've killed one of their cards and prevented them from playing a second one. On the other hand, you can also use this to gain a lot of life, and with Rebound, you cast it again. I like to remind myself by putting my Rebound cards to the top of the deck. So, target player sacrifices a creature, you gain life equal to that creature's toughness. Remember the toughness part. It's not power, but most of the time, you're going to kill a card with this. You need to remember it gains you life, because that may trigger other effects. Darksteel Plate. Darksteel Plate itself is indestructible. Equipped creature is indestructible. Equip for 2. Cost 3, therefore, for 5 mana, you make a creature indestructible. Here we have Death Grasp. Death Grasp deals X damage to target creature or player. You gain X life. One of the life-gaining spells so that you can play Lycia much quicker, or close out the game with this. It can also be spot removal, as we get into the basic lands. 1, 2, 3 plains, 1, 2, 3, 4 mountains, 1, 2, 3, 4 swamps, and now we have a Marshal's Anthem. For 4, it gives +1/+1. When Marshal's Anthem enters the battlefield, return up to X target creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, where X is the number of times Marshal's Anthem was kicked. Martial's Anthem has multi-kicker for 2. Every time you play this card, you have the option of kicking it. Multi-kicker meaning you can play this effect more than once. The X referring to how many times you have kicked it. For 6 mana, it is a renewal spell. For 8 mana it brings 2. 10 mana, it brings 3. It just increases value over the game. And it being an Anthem gives you an extra bonus. Merciless Eviction for 6, the most effective board control, in my opinion. The effect of choosing one of these to destroy, or, exile, means the opponent has really no recourse of getting them back unless they have Pull from Eternity or some obscure exile play. Lightning Greaves for 2 and 0. Equip for 0. Equipped creature has Haste and Shroud. One of the meanest cards to have, but it lets you play your vampires much quicker. All those effects I mentioned that were pretty slow are now attacking the moment they come in. Here we have Crackling Doom. Crackling Doom deals 2 damage to each opponent. Each opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures he or she controls. Board control. In a multiplayer game, it has a lot more value, but for 3, it does sacrifice the opponent's creature. That makes it incredibly useful. And it's their strongest. Ambition's Cost. For 4, you draw 3 cards and you lose 3 life. Simple draw power. Here we have Stenezia Masquerade. For 3, attacking creatures you control have first strike. Whenever vampires you control deal combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Madness 3. Again, not really leaning into the madness effect, but Stenezia being an enchantment that gives your creatures first strike, there's no downside. Painted Bluffs. Just mana fixing, you can put it in any mana fixer. Shimmering Grotto does the same effect for 1 mana and tap it at any mana. It's not optimal. I would recommend anything other than Unknown Shores, Painted Bluffs, and Shimmering Grotto. They're more placeholders for better lands. Rakdos Guildgate enters the battlefield tapped. Path of Ancestry enters the battlefield tapped. Add 1 mana to your mana pool of any color in your commander's color identity. When that mana is spent to cast a creature spell that shares a creature type with your commander, scry 1. It's just free scry. Voldaren Pariah for 5. Flying, sacrifice 3 other creatures, transform Voldaren Pariah, and it has Madness 3. It becomes a 6/5. The flip effect, of course, being your opponent sacrifices 3 creatures. Oh, look at that. Eldrazi Vampire, flying. When this creature transforms, target opponent sacrifices 3 creatures. Very cool, though. Yeah, more Eldrazi cards, but not by the people who made Oath of the Gatewatch, please. We have Thematic Compass. More Ixalan flipping, which is for 2. You get this artifact. Pay 3 mana and tap it. Search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle your library. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 7 or more lands, transform Thematic Compass. You'll remember I had 7 of any color, meaning I'll most likely have 4 basic lands of one color and 3 of the other color. If I have all 4, 8, 9, 10, 11 lands into play, this card is useless to search for, but I clearly have more than enough lands to trigger its flip effect. Its flip being another land. Spires of Orozca. Add colorless to your mana pool. Tap it, untap target attacking creature an opponent controls, and remove it from combat. It says remove it from combat, so it's not from the game. It just means this is essentially a Maze of Ith. By the turn 7, or forcing more draw power by its own effect, you will be able to get your own Maze of Ith. Argyle's Bloodfast for 2. Pay 2, pay 2 life. Draw a card. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 5 or less life, you may transform Argyle's Bloodfast. This is very cheap, easy draw power. In desperate times, you will be flipping it, but ideally you won't. You will get the Temple of Aklazots, which is a nice reference to the new set. Tap it, black. Tap it, sacrifice a creature. You gain life equal to the sacrificed creature's toughness. Here, triggers all those different life gain effects, but the chances of you flipping this are very desperate. It does come into play with all the effects to return back to power, swing in. Life gain is very good at that, but it's harder to build yourself back up rather than it is to continue winning. You want to be in a spot where Argyle's is just used as draw power. Fiend of the Shadows. Flying, Vampire Wizard. Whenever Fiend of the Shadows deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles the top card of his or her hand. Exiles a card from his or her hand. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. Sacrifice a human, regenerate Fiend of the Shadows. Human recursion is not a lot in this deck, but if you can control the opponent's humans, any creatures that are human types or changelings will benefit this. But essentially, you're going to be dealing damage with this card, stealing a card that they give up, and ideally playing it if it is red, black, or white. Here we have Depter's Knell, one of the strongest cards in the game at the time. It has now been outclassed by quite a bit, but it's very cool to have at the beginning of your upkeep. Put target creature card in a graveyard into play under your control. Any creature for 7 on your turn for free. Here we have a board wipe to make sure that you have creatures to play. Day of Judgment for 4, destroy all creatures. That way you can clear the board and start playing more vampires again. After this, and then you play 1 vampire, you'll have a stronger board state. March of Otherworldly Light. As an additional cost to cast the spell, you may exile any number of white cards in your hand. The spell costs 2 less to cast for each card exiled this way. Exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment with mana value X or less. You don't really need to pay a lot of mana into this. Really just get rid of their soul ring, anything that is opposing you. Because it says artifact, creature, or enchantment, it does prevent it from destroying battles or other planeswalkers or creatures. On the other hand, artifact, creature, or enchantment means if anything is part of those effects, you can still destroy it. Let's say an enchantment planeswalker ever comes out. This card will be more useful. Elspeth, Sun's Nemesis. Every deck needs planeswalkers. This would be one of the recurring ones. For 4, legendary planeswalker Elspeth. -1, put up to 2 target creatures you control. Up to 2 target creatures you control each get +2/+1 until the end of turn. Oh, I thought it was a +1/+1 kind of thing. It's only until the end of turn that you get 2/1 attacking, but useful. She does come in with 5 loyalty, so that puts her down to 4 the moment you use it. Creatures, create 2 1/1 human soldier creature tokens. This will produce the very few vampire fodder for you, but useful. And it does gain you 5 life right away, so it will help with Lycia's cost. It will help with all the other effects that need you to gain life. And as well, it has Escape. Exile 4 other cards from your graveyard, play it again with its 6 mana cost. So 10 life, 4/6 humans, a lot of damage. It will be a problem every single time you play it. So you want to have your opponent deal with that problem every time. It will keep them from attacking your other threats, because there will be more threats. Windscarred Craig. Enters the battlefield tapped. Enters tapped, you gain a life. Add white or red. Orzhov Basilica. Enters the battlefield tapped, another bounce land. Add white and black to your mana pool. Stone Quarry enters the battlefield tapped. Add white or red to your mana pool. Ancient Amphitheater, just for those giants. Reveal a giant from your hand. If you don't, Ancient Amphitheater comes into play tapped, so it's most likely going to be coming into play tapped. Here we have Legion's Landing, the last of the flip cards and the last card of the deck. Legendary enchantment like the last one. When it enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. When you attack with 3 or more creatures, transform Legion's Landing. This is a very easy trigger to activate, and once you do, you get Adanto, the first fort. This effect, as a legendary land, is tap to add 1 white mana, pay 3, create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. It is token generation, more creatures to play. It will come useful in the long run. The effect is very easy to trigger, so for 1, you get a vampire that turns into a land. There's no downside. That would be Edgar Markov's deck tech. With his Evidence effect, whenever you cast another vampire spell, if Edgar Markov is in the command zone or on the battlefield, create a 1/1 black vampire creature token. He himself has First Strike Haste as a 6-cost 4/4. Whenever Edgar Markov attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. The moment you play him, your army is buffed. It's incredibly effective. It encourages attacking, like I said. The red will want to attack. You want to have an anger rather than certain other cards in the deck. But that's up to you to decide on what cards you want and what cards you don't want. With Caverns of Ixalan coming out, it means there's way more vampires to choose from. This deck may get upgraded in the future, but as it stands, it does fine on its own.